21 Balloons, Chapter 3, A Description of the Globe. The presidential train answered the cheer of welcome given it by the people of San Francisco with a long, piercing toot. Then, pulling up at the station, it slowed down to a stop, panting and letting off steam, as would any engine that had just completed a cross-country run. The police department had detailed 100 officers to keep the station platform clear. These policemen interlocked their arms, forming a human chain which held the eager crowds back. The presidential train was shorter than usual for greater speed, and was made up only of an engine, coal tender, dining car, and the president's own car, with the familiar observation and speech platform at the rear. The mayor had the carriage, which was to take Professor Sherman to the Western American Explorers Club, pull up opposite the presidential coach, clapped his white-gloved hands twice, and instantly 2 porters appeared with a red carpet strip, which was rolled up like a huge jelly roll. He clapped his hands again, and the red carpet was rolled across the station platform from the professor's carriage to the president's coach. He clapped his hands again, and the official welcoming committee lined up on both sides of the carpet strip, wearing their smart bowlers and polka dot ties. The mayor then reached in his vest pocket and took from there a small silver whistle, which he tooted once. He replaced the whistle, then followed by the chief surgeon of the San Francisco General Hospital, he walked up the red carpet into the presidential train. The whistle toot was evidently the cue to start the music by the combined fire and police department bands. The instantly lovely strains of music were heard. As Professor Sherman, looking rather haggard and worn, descended from the train onto the red-carpeted platform, with the mayor holding him up on one side and the chief surgeon holding him up on the other, a medley of 3 appropriate songs was heard, mingled with the tremendous cheers from the crowd. These 3 songs, selected by the mayor himself, were "Oh, When I Walk," "I Always Walk with Billy, Billy Boy," and "Marching Through Georgia." It was thought afterwards by many that the slim connection between that last song and Professor William Sherman was a bit far-fetched. Professor Sherman was assisted into the back seat of the carriage, and the mayor climbed in and sat beside him. The chief surgeon, acting as a sort of official footman, sat next to the coach while, instead of the chief surgeon, acting as a sort of official footman, sat next to the coachman while, instead of lackeys being like servants, 2 trained nurses sat on the raised seats behind and overlooking the professor. The carriage proceeded up the triumphant avenue from the station to the Explorers Club through thunderous cheers and showers of confetti. Just as the carriage pulled up in front of the club, a sweet-looking, well-scrubbed little girl in a crisp white starched dress, an orphan from St. Catherine's Waif Home, rushed up to the professor, curtsied politely, and presented him with a little bouquet of toy balloons. The professor accepted the bouquet, thanked the little girl, and as the crowd sighed its approval, kissed her on both cheeks. He was then helped out of the carriage, helped up the stairs into the club, up the aisle which parted the packed auditorium in the middle, onto the speaker's platform where a freshly made bed awaited him. The professor sat on the bed as the chief surgeon removed his shoes. He then swung his feet around up on the bed as the chief surgeon covered his lap with a comforter. Then, facing the audience, propped up in bed by 1 bolster and 4 huge pillows, Professor William Waterman Sherman was ready to tell his story. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honour to present Professor Sherman," announced the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, fellow explorers, ladies and gentlemen," said Professor Sherman. A hush fell over the audience. There was a small creaking sound of people getting themselves comfortably set, then silence. "I am happy to be home again." At this, the audience rocked the building with cheers. The hubbub lasted 4 minutes before the crowd settled down again. "I haven't been away very long, but I have certainly missed," the audience, reminded by this remark that the professor had clipped 40 days off the speed record for a trip around the world, broke out into tumultuous applause. This time it lasted for a full 5 minutes. The professor looked helplessly at the mayor, who immediately sensed how he felt. He faced the audience, silenced it, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sherman has had a long and, we feel sure, interesting story to tell. He hasn't had the chance to say 20 words yet, and you have already interrupted him with 10 minutes of applause. The professor isn't running for president. He is recounting a scientific adventure to a scientific club. Kindly refrain from applauding hereafter until the professor has concluded his story, thereby respecting the professor's story and his ill health. Thank you. The crowd responded to this by being absolutely quiet. Professor Sherman turned to the mayor, thanked him with a nod, and started again. It is funny that my trip has ended by being such a fast trip around the world. I find myself referred to now as one of the speediest travellers of all times. Speed wasn't at all what I had in mind when I started out. On the contrary, if all had gone the way I'd hoped, I would still be happily floating around in my balloon, drifting anywhere the wind cared to carry me, east, west, north, or south. It just happened by some strange fate that the wind blew me 3/4 around the world at tremendous speed, and my only moments of rest were once when I crashed in the Pacific, and again after a crash in the Atlantic. The other reason why I took this trip was that I wanted to be alone, detached from the earth in a balloon. But this didn't work out either. My trip wasn't half over when I found myself in a balloon contraption with 80 other people, men, women, and children. For years I had cherished the idea of this trip. As you know, I was a teacher of arithmetic for 40 years. 40 years of being surrounded by a classroom of healthy, prankish students, 40 years of spitballs, 40 years of glue on my seat, sal hepatica in my inkwell, and other devilish tricks. Long about the 36th year, I started yearning to be alone. I amused myself with thinking of many ways of doing this. Trips in small boats, polar expeditions. I joined this explorers club, for after all it seemed to me that the ambition of explorers was to go where no one had gone before. One day I started thinking of a balloon in which I could float around out of everybody's reach. This was the main idea behind my trip, to be where no one would bother me for perhaps 1 full year, away from all such boring things in the daily lives of teachers as daily schedules, having to be in different classrooms at exact times week after week. I planned and worked on designs for my balloon in my spare time, using the experiments of other balloonists as a guide. I wanted a big balloon, one which could keep me in the air for a year, or at least many months. Big balloons are a problem. Unless they are designed with great care, they are ripped to shreds by the wind while they are being inflated. Once a balloon is in the air, it offers little resistance to the wind and isn't bothered by it. But when it is tied down on the ground and being filled up with hydrogen, it is at the wind's mercy. I followed the plans of the great French balloonist Giffard, whose captive balloon, the Clos, is the biggest balloon ever built. His balloon was constructed of 7 alternating thicknesses of rubber and silk. I planned my balloon, which I christened the Globe, with 4 alternating thicknesses of rubber and silk. My balloon was 6,000 cubic yards in size, which is just about 10 times the size of a standard balloon. The Globe was one of the biggest free balloons ever built. I wanted a big balloon for 2 reasons. First of all, as I have already said, to keep me in the air for a long time. My second reason was that I wanted a big basket to live in, and it would take a huge balloon to lift the basket I had in mind. As you know, the standard balloon basket is just a little compartment, about big enough for 2 men to stand in or 1 man to sit down in, and altogether impossible to sleep in. There is little room for provisions, and it would be impossible to live in a standard balloon basket for any length of time. This goes without saying. I looked to the work of another French balloonist named Nader. Nader bought himself a big balloon which he christened Ghent, and attached to this a real little basket house. It had a door, windows, a staircase which led up to its little roof. The roof of the house was bordered by a woven balustrade, furnished with wicker furniture, and was an ideal observation platform. The inside of the house was appropriately and comfortably furnished. This was a basket weaver's masterpiece. It was light, strong, and comfortable. I designed my basket house in much the same manner, but with a few changes. I didn't use the roof of my woven house as an observation platform, but rather as a sort of open-air attic in which to store food. For observation, there was a small porch all the way around my house, with light uprights and balustrades made of bamboo. This porch was quite like the deck of a ship. Nadère's balloon wasn't built as mine was, with the idea of taking very long trips or staying in the air many months. He therefore didn't have to worry much about ballast. The way you take an ordinary trip in a balloon is quite simple. The balloon is tied down with several ropes while it is being filled with gas. When it is full, you give the command to cut the ropes and you fly off. The balloon will instantly leap into the air and carry you high up in the sky, the height depending on the amount of gas in the balloon and the amount of weight you are carrying. When you want to come down, you pull a rope which lets some of the gas out of the bag. If you want to climb higher, you must throw something overboard which will make the balloon lighter. Nadère carried bags of sand which he threw overboard when he wanted to gain altitude. Sand is the usual ballast used by all balloonists. I couldn't afford to use sand as ballast because in order to stay up in the air and live comfortably for a long period of time, I had to make sure every ounce I carried with me count. I used food for ballast. I thought this to be ideal for a long trip. With food for ballast, every time I threw a pail of garbage overboard, I would go a little higher. Thus, for every unnecessary sandbag, I could carry extra food to make my trip last longer. My balloon house was furnished with the lightest of everything. The usual mattress is too heavy and is only used at night anyway. I designed a mattress made of the same material as my balloon and filled with gas. With a sheet over it, it stayed on the floor and was most soft and comfortable. When I pulled the sheet off, it floated to the ceiling and was thus stored out of my way in the daytime. I had chairs and a table made of balsa wood and bamboo. I had a library of paper-bound books printed in small type. My foods and liquids were chosen with the idea of saving weight. I carried a strong shark fishing rod with the hope of carrying a few fish to increase my food supply. Some balloonists who recently planned ocean voyages, such as the Americans John Bois and T.C. Lowe, attached lifeboats to their balloons in case of a crash in the water. I couldn't see carrying this extra weight. I had a tailor make me 2 waterproof suits out of balloon cloth and carried a cork lifesaver. If I crashed, I figured that this type of suit would keep me dry and the lifesaver would keep me above water. These suits were wonderful. They were light and being both waterproof and airtight were extremely warm. I planned to wear one and wash the other by attaching it to my shark fishing rod and dunking it in the ocean. All of my laundry was done in this manner. The rest of my clothes were simply the lighter variety of everyday menswear. The Higgins Balloon Factory took a year to build my balloon, and I must say they made a fine job of it. It was finished August 10th of this year. I had one excellent trial flight in my balloon, which I thought was enough. It was a short flight and everything worked perfectly. The only mishap was that I broke every plate and glass in my woven house when I came down a little too fast. I corrected this by having silver plates made to replace the dishes, and used a silver cup instead of glasses. The plates and cup had small handles on them, so I could tie them onto my fishing rod and wash them by dunking them in the ocean. I spent 2 days in outfitting my balloon with the proper provisions. I carried a small still for making fresh water out of salt water, and a medium-sized keg of quinine tonic. I was soon all set for my trip. Higgins notified the press that I had intentions of taking a long trip in a giant balloon, which might easily end up in my being the first to fly across the Pacific Ocean. The newspapers carried the story, giving it about half a column on the 4th page. The public wasn't at all interested in my trip then. I think it was because Higgins told all the newspapermen that my balloon wasn't quite as big as Nadère's. The public had heard of Nadère's giant balloon and I'm sure would have been curious to see it, but mine, which was just a shade smaller, was looked upon as just a runner-up. As I sailed away August 15th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was amused to see that only 4 of my closest friends were on hand to see me off. I told them I would be up for a year. Well, that's the way I had planned it then. I waved goodbye and gave the command to let her go.